In the year 945, Prince Igor of Kiev, ruler of the Kievan Rus, met a brutal and ignoble end. While attempting to collect tribute from the Drevlian tribe, a Slavic people in the western territories of his realm, he was captured and killed in a manner that was both humiliating and grotesque. According to the primary chronicle, the Drevlians tied his legs to two bent birch trees, which, when released, tore his body in half. This method of execution was not only designed to inflict maximal physical suffering, but to symbolize the shattering of unity, the prince's body literally torn apart as a metaphor for ruptured authority. With Igor's death, Kiev was thrown into a dangerous limbo. Power passed nominally to his wife Olga, a noblewoman of unclear origin, possibly from Pskov or Scandinavian stock, who suddenly found herself regent of a volatile and decentralized polity. More crucially, she was mother to a child, the young heir Sviatoslav, too small to wield a sword, let alone rule a patchwork federation of Slavic and Finnic tribes bound only by trade tribute and intimidation. To outside observers, Olga's regency would have appeared tenuous. She lacked the military reputation of her late husband, and ruled over a realm where succession was fluid and often contested. Her husband had died in a failed attempt to assert dominance over the Drevlian tribe, which raised an immediate question: would the Drevlians see opportunity in this vacuum, or fear and retaliation? The Drevlians chose boldness. They likely assumed that the newly widowed Olga would seek to maintain peace for the sake of her son, and perhaps even accept a political alliance. Thus, in an audacious move, they dispatched envoys to Kiev to propose a marriage. Their candidate, Prince Mal, the man believed to have ordered Igor's death. It was not merely a marriage proposal, it was a bid for dominion over Kiev itself. By wedding, the queen regent, the Drevlians, would gain de facto control over the Rus. At this stage, Olga held none of the military prestige that would later define her rule. But what she did possess was something far more dangerous in the immediate term: absolute command over Kiev's administration, intelligence, and ritual apparatus. With her late husband gone, Olga was the undisputed ruler within the city walls, and unlike her enemies, she understood the weight of ceremony and the power of spectacle. She received the Drevlian envoys with deliberate hospitality, neither cold nor warm. Her face betrayed nothing. They presented their offer, couching it in diplomatic flattery. Olga, with disarming calm, replied that their message was agreeable to her, but that such a proposal required proper protocol. She instructed them to return to their boat the next day, where they would be given public honors by the people of Kiev. What followed would begin a patterned ceremonial trappings, masking imminent death. That night, Olga made quiet arrangements with her guards and loyal attendants. A pit was dug in secret large enough to swallow a group of men. The next morning, the Drevlians were fetched from their ship and paraded through the streets as if they were honored guests. As they approached the central court, they were asked by tradition to be carried in their boat across the city, a symbolic act of reverence. This, too, was carefully staged. With fanfare, the boat and its occupants were hauled through the gates and brought to the location of the feast. There, at Olga's signal, the vessel was tilted into the pit and buried alive. Not a single envoy survived. It was an execution cloaked in ritual. The message to the Drevlians was crystalline. Their overture was not only rejected, it was punished with the full weight of humiliation and erasure. But Olga did not stop there. She knew that a single act of vengeance might provoke retaliation. What she needed was a campaign, not a war of armies, but of illusions, rituals, and methodical terror. While she prepared the next stage of retaliation, it's worth noting the psychological edge of Olga's response. The burial of the envoys in their own boat was not a random choice. Among Slavic and Norse peoples of the region, the boat burial had funerary connotations often reserved for chieftains or honored warriors. By weaponizing this cultural symbol into a trap, Olga transformed a mark of dignity into one of disgrace. It was not just execution, it was desecration masquerading as honor. Meanwhile, the Drevlians, unaware of their envoy's fate, waited for word from Kiev. Days passed, then weeks. No response came. Still assuming the regency to be unstable and malleable, they dispatched a second delegation, larger and more authoritative, perhaps expecting to pressure the queen more directly. They would not live to report back. Olga was in no hurry. She understood that real power did not lie in battlefield valor alone. It resided in psychological control, in the choreography of death that left no room for ambiguity. In a society without newspapers or widespread literacy, spectacle was truth, and she was preparing another performance. The murder of Prince Igor had marked a turning point, not simply in the dynastic continuity of the Rurikid line, but in the political maturity of Kievan Russes. For the first time, the realm would be ruled not by a warrior prince, but by a woman. Yet Olga did not retreat into defensive leadership. She did not secure alliances or sue for peace. She orchestrated vengeance with an almost bureaucratic precision, blending local custom tribal codes of honor and raw terror into a system of calculated reprisal. What made her different was not only her resolve, but her understanding of the psychology of her enemies. Where Igor had underestimated the Drevlians demanding excessive tribute and exposing himself to betrayal, Olga identified their assumptions and turned them into instruments of destruction. This was only the beginning. The bodies buried in the pit were not the apex of her cruelty, but its first notes. What followed would be darker, stranger, and even more symbolic. The Drevlian delegation was already en route. The second Drevlian delegation arrived in Kiev, unaware that the first had been extinguished. They brought gifts, formalities, and the same proposal that Queen Olga marry Prince Mal. Unlike the first group, these envoys were of higher-rank nobles and trusted officials sent to finalize the union and secure a smooth political transition. Their demeanor was assured, even expectant. The Drevlians likely assumed that the delay in response was due to internal deliberations or the queen's mourning not subterfuge. Olga received them with outward courtesy, masking her intentions behind a veil of protocol. She informed them that their proposal had been favorably considered and invited them to rest and wash after their long journey. According to the customs of the time, this was not merely hospitality, it was expected. Cleanliness before any diplomatic engagement was a sign of respect. To provide this service, Olga directed her servants to prepare a bathhouse specifically for the envoys. The building, a simple structure of timber and stone, had been hastily constructed near the palace grounds. The envoys, weary from travel, entered without suspicion. No guards followed them. The doors closed behind them. And then they were locked. Moments later, the bathhouse was set ablaze. Outside, the queen's men fed dry timber into the fire, sealing every crack to ensure no smoke would escape and no cry would be heard. Inside, the Drevlians suffocated and burned. The structure collapsed inward by morning. This second act of vengeance was more visceral than the first. Whereas the live burial mimicked honor, only to strip it away, the bathhouse killing mocked hospitality itself. Bathing, a quasi-sacred act in many early Slavic cultures, was associated with purification, health, and ritual renewal. By converting a space of cleansing into a furnace of death, Olga signaled a perverse inversion of trust. Her enemies would not be reborn, they would be scorched out of memory. The Drevlians, now missing 2 diplomatic missions, began to suspect treachery. Yet no open conflict erupted. Why? Likely because Olga acted faster than they could organize a coherent response. Rather than wait for them to piece together her motives, she moved to the next phase of her campaign, a striking escalation that would exploit both religious tradition and military unpreparedness. With the deaths of 2 envoys concealed, Olga sent her own messengers to Deriva, the Drevlian heartland. She offered to visit the land herself and perform the funeral rites for her late husband, Prince Igor. Her request was not unusual. In early Rus's culture, funeral feasts were public spectacles involving multiple days of mourning, shared food, and the reaffirmation of political loyalties. By volunteering to oversee this ritual, Olga framed herself as a grieving widow making a conciliatory gesture. The Drevlians, perhaps unnerved, but still grasping for diplomatic closure, agreed. They invited her to their capital, Iskorostan, the very city where her husband had been killed. Olga arrived with a retinue small enough to appear peaceful, yet large enough to secure the site. She requested that the funeral feast be prepared with full honors. The Drevlians complied, arranging a lavish celebration. Then came the night of the slaughter. As the feast reached its peak and the Drevlians grew drunk, Olga gave the signal. Her men, armed and waiting, fell upon the hosts. According to the primary chronicle, over 5,000 Drevlians were killed in a single night. This number is likely exaggerated, yet the massacre was real and devastating. The survivors were left stunned, unable to comprehend how mourning had turned to massacre. In less than a year, Olga had dismantled the Drevlian elite through ritualistic executions without ever declaring formal war. Her methods were brutal but calculated to the point of strategy. Each act followed a logic of psychological warfare betrayal, hidden in ceremony murder clothed in custom. It is worth pausing to examine the implications of these killings. To a modern observer, Olga's actions might seem excessively cruel, but in the political environment of 10th century Eastern Europe, the absence of centralized authority made displays of power essential for legitimacy. The concept of a state monopoly on violence did not exist. Instead, rulers had to demonstrate that they could not only defend their position, but avenge any slight with overwhelming retribution. Failure to do so invited insubordination. Olga's vengeance was not random. It was judicial, even administrative. By eliminating successive layers of Drevlian leadership, she ensured that no rival power could regroup or retaliate. Moreover, her methods became the medium. Ritual violence, when publicly known, served to inoculate other tribes against rebellion. This wasn't just a matter of punishing one tribe. It was about establishing an architecture of deterrence across the Russ's domain. There are indications that her punishments were also meant to disorient and confuse. By using bathhouses, boats' feasts, and funeral rites as traps, she dismantled the shared grammar of trust that bound elites together. Diplomacy was no longer safe. Ritual was no longer sacred. In one particularly disturbing local tale not widely recorded, but preserved in later Slavic folklore, it is said that Olga ordered the hands of some captured Drevlians to be nailed to drinking tables during the feast, to keep them seated during the slaughter. Whether or not this detail is factual, its persistence in oral tradition speaks to the horror her actions inspired. But her campaign was not yet complete. Olga had destroyed the Drevlians' diplomatic corps and massacred their nobility. Now she turned her attention to Iskorostan itself, the city that had dared to murder a sovereign and propose marriage to his widow. The siege that followed would not only break the Drevlian resistance, it would burn its capital to ash in a way so inventive and horrific that it would enter legend. Still, one must ask, why didn't the Drevlians anticipate revenge? Part of the answer lies in gender. As a woman ruler in a warrior culture, Olga may have been seen as incapable of coordinated military action. Her grief, her youth, and her perceived passivity were all underestimated. The Drevlians likely assumed she would seek to stabilize the regency quietly. They assumed wrong. With 2 diplomatic missions eradicated and a massacre executed during a funeral feast, Queen Olga had stripped the Drevlian nobility of its leadership. What remained was the fortified city of Iskorostan, the Drevlian capital, and the place where her husband had met his gruesome end. Her vengeance was not yet complete. Olga now prepared for open siege not as a panicked regent reacting to rebellion, but as a ruler exacting systemic punishment with cold, deliberate force. The campaign against Iskorostan was a calculated move. She did not rush to assault the city immediately after the funeral feast slaughter. Instead, she returned to Kiev to gather troops and supplies, giving the Drevlians time to stew in confusion and fear. Word of her actions had likely begun to circulate among nearby tribes, fragmented and inconsistent perhaps, but potent enough to cast her in a new light, no longer a passive widow, but a ruler capable of orchestrated brutality under the veil of diplomacy. When Olga's forces finally arrived at the gates of Iskorostan, the Drevlians were ready, or at least they believed they were. The fortified city had survived previous threats and was positioned deep within the forests of modern-day Ukraine. Its wooden palisades and earthworks offered a strong defensive position. The Drevlians had reason to hope they could outlast the siege, but Olga had no intention of playing by conventional military rules. According to the primary chronicle, the siege dragged on with limited success. The city's defenses were formidable, and a protracted campaign threatened to drain resources and delay other state affairs. Olga, ever adaptive, offered the citizens of Iskorostan a surprising compromise. She would lift the siege if they paid her a symbolic tribute, not in gold or cattle, but in birds. Specifically, she requested 3 pigeons and 3 sparrows from each household in the city. At face value, the offer appeared merciful, even eccentric. The Drevlians, desperate to end the siege and avoid further bloodshed, agreed to the terms. They gathered the birds and delivered them to Olga's camp. What followed, however, remains one of the most infamous acts of psychological warfare in medieval history. Olga ordered her soldiers to tie small, sulfur-bound cloth bundles to the legs of each bird. When night fell, the birds were released, each flying instinctively toward its roost, located in the wooden homes towers and thatched rooftops of Iskorostan. The moment the birds returned to the city, the dry rooftops ignited simultaneously. The fire spread with unnatural speed and eerie coordination. Chaos erupted. With no centralized point of ignition, there was no way to contain the flames. Every building became a pyre, every home a furnace. The imagery is disturbing pigeons and sparrows, symbols of peace and domestic life, transformed into instruments of fire and destruction. The attack weaponized nature itself, turning the ordinary into the catastrophic. Whether the chronicle exaggerates the totality of the destruction is uncertain, but even partial success would have resulted in panic destruction of food stores and a collapse in defensive morale. As the city burned, Olga's forces stormed its smoldering remains. Survivors were slaughtered or enslaved. Some were left alive, but only to serve as conduits of her will. According to the sources, she spared a remnant of the population in exchange for continued tribute and submission to her rule. The fall of Iskorostan marked the end of organized Drevlian resistance. The political execution of their nobility had been meticulous. Their city now lay in ruins. In fewer than 2 years, Olga had accomplished what many male rulers had failed to do. Over longer reigns, she not only avenged a regicide, but dismantled a rival polity through total strategic domination. Her siege of Iskorostan, particularly the use of incendiary birds, has often been met with skepticism. While modern historians debate its literal truth, the act has an important symbolic function in medieval Slavic chronicles. It communicates Olga's ingenuity, her control over both the natural and social order, and her ability to reimagine warfare as something more than brute strength. If not entirely factual, it certainly reflected how contemporaries understood her capabilities, terrifying, clever, and unbound by convention. Equally significant is the cultural logic of this form of punishment. In many early societies, including those of the Slavic tribes, the destruction of one's home, particularly by fire, was not only materially ruinous, but spiritually desecrating. Fire purified and erased. To die in fire or to have one's home burned down could signify cosmic judgment or divine wrath. Olga's siege did more than conquer a city. It erased its sacred geography. Obscure archaeological evidence lends credence to some elements of the chronicle's tale. Burn layers dated to the mid-10th century have been found in the vicinity of Korostan, a modern city in Ukraine often identified with ancient Iskorostan, suggesting a destructive event around the time of Olga's campaign. Whether caused by intentional arson, siege combat, or accident, these layers align with the historical timeline of the Drevlian downfall. This episode also reveals Olga's understanding of state building. Her vengeance had never been merely personal, it had been political. Each act of destruction was paired with mechanisms of absorption survivors who were taxed, spared, and integrated into the growing Kievan Rus. The Drevlians were not wiped out entirely. They were reconfigured as tributaries. One of the most chilling aspects of this episode lies not in the fire itself, but in the methodical nature of its orchestration. Olga did not lash out in rage. She planned, paused, waited. She used birds not because they were convenient, but because they symbolized control over nature, over homes, over the very instincts that rooted people to place. That she achieved this as a woman in a society dominated by male warrior elites only deepened the psychological impact. By the time the smoke cleared, Queen Olga of Kiev had not only avenged her husband, but reasserted the supremacy of Kiev in the volatile tribal order of Eastern Europe. She had proven that the central state could impose law-punished defiance and absorb rebellious territories through terror and spectacle alike. And yet, even as Olga solidified her grip on power through fire and blood, her next great transformation would emerge from a radically different source, one not of destruction but of belief. In the aftermath of Iskorostan's destruction, Olga found herself standing atop a dominion forcibly unified through vengeance. The Drevlian threat had been extinguished, its nobility dead, its capital in ruins, its people folded into the expanding Kievan Rus. But consolidation required more than conquest. Olga now faced the challenge of sustaining her authority across a culturally diverse realm that stretched from the Baltic to the Black Sea. Violence, effective as it had been, could not serve as the sole foundation of lasting rule. Yet before she would pivot to diplomacy or reform, one final ritual of power remained. A performance designed not for mass destruction, but for intimate symbolic slaughter. Following the fiery siege of Iskorostan, a small Drevlian remnant still clung to fragmented autonomy. Isolated village heads and scattered nobles resisted Kiev's emissaries. Olga, relentless in her effort to neutralize any remaining challenge, devised a final act, one not of battlefield strategy, but of theatrical execution. She summoned representatives from surviving Drevlian settlements under the pretext of formal reconciliation. The plan to host a ceremonial feast marking the restoration of harmony between the Kievans and the now subjugated Drevlians. The ritualized banquet was a common feature of early medieval politics, used to settle feuds and re-establish loyalty after periods of conflict. Olga understood this tradition and weaponized it with precision. The feast was held near the ruins of Iskorostan in an open-air pavilion constructed for the occasion. Attendees arrived dressed in formal garb, bearing tribute and modest gifts. Many brought symbols of peace, carved wooden offerings, embroidered cloths, or clay idols representing household gods. All these were carefully catalogued by Olga's attendants. At first, the event unfolded as expected. Attendees were served food and drink in abundance, entertained by music and dancing. Olga presided with calculated grace. She offered toasts in memory of Prince Igor, mourned the suffering on both sides, and spoke of future stability. She honored the dead with solemnity, invoking the spirits of the forest and river's traditional entities in Slavic cosmology. As the feast progressed, the guests drank deeply. Intoxication was not only expected, it was encouraged. In this culture, drunkenness was often associated with spiritual communion and the breaking of earthly hierarchies. In many communities, peace was ritually sealed through shared inebriation, with cups passed in sequence to dissolve past offenses. Olga let this custom play out in full. Only once the guests were nearly insensible did her soldiers emerge from the tree line. The slaughter was swift and calculated. The guests, weaponless and dazed, were cut down where they sat. No quarter was given. Those who tried to flee were struck down at the pavilion's edge. Olga remained seated through most of it, issuing orders with quiet finality. According to some later chronicles, the remains of the dead were left on the blood-soaked grass until morning, a silent message to nearby villagers who might consider defiance. This final purge ensured that no Drevlian leader survived the conflict, and it serves as one of the darkest, least discussed aspects of Olga's campaign. It is absent from many formal records, yet preserved in fragments of oral folklore and regional memory. In one such tale, a Drevlian elder suspecting treachery tried to slip a charm beneath his belt before attending the feast, only to be disemboweled before he could reach for it. What's notable about this act isn't merely its violence, but its ritual quality. Olga did not just eliminate threats, she inverted every expectation of political ceremony. She buried envoys during a diplomatic reception. She burned others alive in a bathhouse. She turned a funeral into a massacre and now a reconciliation banquet into an execution ground. Each time, the familiar framework of hospitality and trust was twisted into its opposite. This was psychological warfare on a cultural level. Such actions left more than physical devastation. They eroded the invisible frameworks of custom that held tribal politics together. The unwritten rules governing how peace was negotiated, how feasts reaffirmed bonds, how rights could heal wounds, Olga shattered them all. She replaced these social norms with a stark new reality. Kiev was supreme, and its ruler was both arbiter and executioner. Having completed the systematic annihilation of the Drevlian elite, Olga turned inward to restructure governance. She established new centers of tribute collection and reassigned administrative roles to loyal nobles and relatives. In place of the Drevlian leadership, she installed governors loyal to her household, ensuring that no local uprising could take root. She did not depopulate the region entirely, but ensured it remained under close watch. Though often overshadowed by her more theatrical deeds, this administrative foresight laid the foundation for Kievan Rus's transformation into a more centralized polity. Olga understood that power needed permanence, and permanence required rules even if those rules had to be written in blood. Equally important was her transformation in public perception. Her campaign had redefined gender expectations in early Rus's society. Though women of noble status could hold power, especially as regents, their rule was often seen as temporary, fragile, or symbolic. Olga's actions obliterated this framework. She did not govern on behalf of her son. She governed in her own right, not merely as a placeholder, but as a sovereign. Her authority came not from the battlefield in the traditional sense, but from her orchestration of ritualistic dominance. She did not need to lead charges with a sword. She waged war through theater manipulation and symbolic inversion. That she succeeded in a society that revered martial masculinity speaks to the potency of her methods and the depth of her intelligence. Still, her legacy at this point remained soaked in violence. The Rus were stabilizing, but the path forward required a new form of legitimacy, one that could extend beyond tribal politics and regional vendettas. Olga now turned her gaze beyond the forests and rivers of her homeland toward the gleaming spires of Constantinople. There she would seek not revenge but redemption, or at least transformation. And she would return from Byzantium not as a widow avenger, but as the baptized matriarch of a Christianized Russian. When the fires of war and vengeance had cooled, Queen Olga stood atop a reshaped Kievan Rus. She had orchestrated the near-total destruction of the Drevlians, avenging her husband's gruesome murder with an exacting sequence of calculated reprisals. But despite the outward image of power, she understood that no reign could endure on terror alone. Sustained governance required recognition, not merely from subjugated tribes, but from the great powers beyond the steppe. And for the Kievan Rus in the mid-10th century, the greatest of these was Byzantium. The Byzantine Empire, centered in Constantinople, was the preeminent superpower of Eastern Europe and the Near East. Its imperial court stood as the pinnacle of culture diplomacy and Christian hegemony. Its emperors ruled not only with armies, but with an ideology that fused Roman legality, Orthodox Christianity, and a bureaucratic sophistication. For a pagan polity like the Kievan Rus' engagement with Byzantium could mean access to trade religion literacy, and perhaps most critically legitimacy. Olga recognized this. In either 954 or 957, CE dates vary, depending on sources. She journeyed to Constantinople, accompanied by a delegation of high-ranking retainers. The voyage itself was significant down the Dnieper across the Black Sea, and into the imperial harbor of the Bosporus. She arrived not as a supplicant, but as a sovereign emissary. This alone distinguished her from the many warlords and chieftains who had previously threatened or begged at Byzantium's gates. Emperor Constantine VII, known as Porphyrogenitus, born in the purple, received her personally. His court, highly ceremonial and obsessed with protocol, would not have extended such honors casually. Olga's visit was meticulously recorded in Constantine's own work, De Ceremoniis Aulae Byzantinae, a handbook detailing court rituals. There she is, identified as Helga, a transliteration from the Norse form of her name, indicating her Scandinavian roots, perhaps a reminder of the Varangian ancestry that still lingered in the Kievan elite. The most consequential moment of her visit was her baptism into Christianity. Though the Rus had long interacted with Christian peoples through trade war and diplomacy, Olga's conversion marked a seismic shift. The sources claim that Constantine himself served as her godfather during the ceremony. She took the Christian name Elena, likely after Helena, the mother of Constantine the Great. However, a strange wrinkle appears in the Byzantine account. Constantine allegedly proposed marriage to Olga following her baptism, only for her to refuse, citing the newly established godparent relationship between them. In Orthodox Christian law, this spiritual kinship rendered marriage incestuous. Whether this exchange actually occurred or was Byzantine courtly embellishment is uncertain. But it served the purpose of casting Olga not only as a shrewd diplomat, but as a Christian with theological fluency, someone who could outmaneuver even an emperor on ecclesiastical terms. More than personal salvation, Olga's baptism had strategic dimensions. It signaled to both internal and external observers that the Kievan Rus was entering a new ideological sphere. Christianity offered not just religious doctrine, but access to a transnational political language. The act aligned Olga with the Christian monarchs of Europe, granting her new tools for legitimacy. But it also complicated her rule. At the time of her conversion, Olga ruled over a predominantly pagan population. The Rus' elite remained rooted in Norse and Slavic traditions, ancestor worship, sacred groves, ritual sacrifice, and animistic beliefs. Her son Sviatoslav, now of age and taking on military campaigns, was a staunch adherent of the old ways. When informed of her baptism, he reportedly scoffed. "My followers would laugh at me if I were to accept baptism." Olga did not press him, nor did she impose Christianity on her people by force. Instead, she returned to Kiev and began a quieter campaign of religious infrastructure. She invited priests from Byzantium, built the first known churches within the city walls, and maintained contact with Christian communities in Crimea and Bulgaria. One church, known as the Church of the Savior, was said to have been built under her direct supervision, a simple wooden structure that nonetheless marked a profound ideological shift. What distinguishes this period of Olga's rule is its duality. She had transformed from a ruler of fire and death into a matriarch of diplomacy and spiritual reform. Yet she never renounced her earlier deeds. She remained unrepentant for the execution of her husband's killers. The faith she adopted was not used to cleanse the past, but to reorient the future. In many ways, her baptism served as a bridge between world's pagan vengeance and Christian mercy, tribal autonomy, and imperial hierarchy. She retained her authority in the steppe through calculated political control, while simultaneously adopting the symbols of a higher moral order. This balance required delicate management. The Kievan Rus was not yet ready for full Christianization, but Olga had planted the ideological seed. A particularly obscure and unsettling account from Byzantine writings notes that Olga insisted on retaining elements of pagan ritual even after baptism. In one tale, she allegedly refused to destroy an ancestral idol near her residence, choosing instead to have it dressed in linen and buried beneath a tree rather than desecrated. Whether this indicates lingering pagan sentiment or strategic cultural preservation is unclear, but it underscores the complexity of her conversion. She was not a zealot. She was an architect of synthesis. Furthermore, her time in Constantinople exposed her to Byzantine administration ceremony and legal structures. Though the Ruses would not adopt these formally until later, Olga's experience laid the groundwork for future reforms under her descendants. She likely returned to Kiev not only with priests but with new ideas about bureaucracy, trade regulation, and diplomacy elements that would influence the evolving Rus' court. By the time she returned to Kiev, Olga had achieved what no ruler of Rus' before her had done. She had forged personal ties with the greatest empire of the East, received its sacraments, and returned with the trappings of spiritual authority. Her position, once sustained by fear, was now girded by ideology. Still, the transformation was incomplete. The people remained largely pagan. Her son was indifferent at best. But the realm she left behind was no longer the fragmented tribal confederation it had been at Igor's death. It was a state in embryonic form, rooted in violence tempered by diplomacy, and now shaped by the first glimmers of religious identity. The next step in that evolution would fall to her grandchildren. But it was Olga who laid the foundations. Through fire and faith, she had remade the Kievan Rus. After her return from Constantinople, Queen Olga re-entered a land that she had irrevocably transformed. The Drevlians were subdued, their elites extinguished, and their territories absorbed into the administrative fold of Kiev. Her diplomatic pivot toward Byzantium had opened new cultural and ideological frontiers. But while her mind now turned toward faith and reform, the region she ruled remained defined by the patterns of violence and instability that had characterized its rise. The Kievan Rus was still young, its political identity fragile, and its survival dependent on the continual assertion of dominance over neighboring tribes. It was in this setting that Olga faced a final wave of political threats, not from without, but from within the broader territory of the Rus. The unification of diverse tribes, each with its own leaders, customs, and loyalties, had never been total. Resentments brewed just beneath the surface. Local leaders resented tribute demands. Pagan priests mistrusted Christian influence. And even within her own household, divisions emerged. Her son Sviatoslav had reached adulthood and begun to carve his own legacy in blood and conquest. Unlike his mother, he rejected Christianity outright and viewed diplomacy as secondary to martial glory. Where Olga had used ritual manipulation and diplomacy, Sviatoslav employed a directness that was both admired and feared. He raised armies of Varangian mercenaries and launched campaigns against the Khazars, the Volga Bulgars, and eventually Byzantium itself. Olga, still technically regent and senior in political authority, now had to navigate this complex dynamic. She did not abdicate power but slowly receded from military leadership, focusing her energies on consolidating governance, codifying tribute systems, and reinforcing Christian infrastructure in Kiev and its surrounding regions. One of her most enduring contributions during this period was the reform of tribute collection. Prior to her interventions, tribute known as poliudia was a chaotic and often predatory practice. Princes and their entourages would ride from settlement to settlement demanding goods, wealth, and labor as payment for protection. It was precisely during one of these circuits that Igor had been killed. Olga recognized the system's volatility and moved to restructure it into a more predictable and bureaucratic form. She established fixed points of tribute collection, known as pogosti administrative centers, that functioned as early proto-towns. These became hubs of not only taxation, but governance, trade, and ecclesiastical activity. By creating fixed locations, she reduced the risk of violent encounters and began the gradual shift from itinerant rule to territorial administration. In doing so, she planted the seeds of urbanization and centralized control. These administrative reforms might seem mundane compared to her earlier campaigns of fire and slaughter, but they were revolutionary in their implications. The pogosti system reduced the dependence of rulers on personal charisma and armed retinues. It replaced violence with taxation, tribute with policy. It also facilitated the expansion of Christianity, as these centers often hosted churches and missionary activity. Still, this period was not devoid of darkness. As Christianity gained modest ground in the capital, Olga found herself the subject of whispered superstitions. Some pagans claimed that her baptism had cursed the land. Failed harvests and localized plagues were blamed on her abandonment of the gods. In the countryside, folk tales began to circulate of ghostly birds and phantom fires, echoes of the destruction of Iskorostan, now cloaked in myth. In one such tale, villagers spoke of Olga's crows descending from the sky each spring, bringing disease in their wings. These tales reflect more than folklore. They indicate the cultural dissonance provoked by her rule. Olga had challenged deep-rooted customs, inverted rituals, and embraced a foreign faith. To many, she was not just a queen. She was an unsettling force, a liminal figure who existed between pagan and Christian worlds, between woman and sovereign, between the visible and the feared. Yet even among these whispers, her power endured. Her ability to enforce stability, expand trade, and maintain political continuity in a land still simmering with tribal tensions was without parallel in Eastern Europe at the time. A lesser-known episode from this period underscores the scale of her influence. When a band of rebellious northern tribes threatened to disrupt trade along the Volkhov River, Olga dispatched emissaries not with threats, but with offers of legal arbitration. She promised to send scribes and judges who would mediate disputes and codify agreements. In return, the tribes would pay regular tribute and accept representatives of the new Christian faith. Some complied. Others resisted only to find themselves visited by punitive raids, executed not by Olga herself, but by the princes and governors she had elevated. It was a subtle but vital transformation, the shift from a ruler executing revenge with her own hands to one delegating authority through institutional structures. Olga had become the architect of a proto-state. Nonetheless, her relationship with her son grew increasingly strained. Sviatoslav had no interest in administration or the spread of Christianity. His ambition was military. He often left Kiev for months at a time, leading campaigns across the steppe. In his absence, Olga resumed governance, maintaining the court, overseeing diplomatic contacts with Byzantium, and mediating tribal disputes. Though they disagreed on ideology, Sviatoslav respected his mother's ability to maintain domestic order. He entrusted her with Kiev's administration during his frequent absences, a rare arrangement in a period when succession often invited assassination or rebellion. Her authority rooted now in decades of strategic terror. Diplomatic acumen and bureaucratic reform was nearly unassailable. By the early 960s, Olga had become more than a regent. She was the axis around which the realm turned. With increasing age and growing spiritual conviction, she doubled down on her Christian patronage. She reportedly invited missionaries from Germany, sought the appointment of a bishop for Kiev, and worked to ensure that her faith would outlast her reign, even if it had not yet overtaken the hearts of her people. There is a certain historical irony in this phase of her life. The woman who had orchestrated massacres in bathhouses and feast halls now hosted clerics and foreign priests at her court. She still held the loyalty of warriors, but now corresponded with metropolitans and abbots, and she still remembered the blood price she had once extracted from the Drevlians, reminded no doubt by their disappearance from the political map. Her transformation was not a contradiction. It was a continuation. Just as she had once buried her enemies beneath the illusions of hospitality, she now buried the pagan world beneath the institutions of administration and the rituals of a new faith. Her method was the same: reshape expectations, turn custom inside out, and build permanence from the ashes of disruption. The stage was nearly set for her final act, not of warfare, but of spiritual legacy. Olga had burned cities and baptized herself in the court of emperors. But would her Christian vision take root in the hardened soil of Rus? That would depend not on her son, but on her grandson, a child not yet born, but already the imagined vessel of her enduring influence. By the time Queen Olga entered the final decade of her life, she had already cemented her place as the most formidable figure in early Kievan Rus's history. Her vengeance against the Drevlians had eliminated any doubt of her political acumen, while her turn toward Christianity had realigned her realm within the orbit of Byzantine power. Yet despite her accomplishments, she ruled a kingdom still split between two worlds, one steeped in ancestral pagan traditions, and the other leaning toward a Christian future she alone had envisioned. The tension between these two identities came to define her later reign. She was, by all accounts, a sincere convert, perhaps even a devout one. But her conversion had not brought about mass religious change. Her son Sviatoslav remained firmly committed to the old gods and warrior culture, and unlike his mother, he had little interest in diplomacy or the ideological transformations that came with foreign faith. For Sviatoslav, power came from the blade, not the cross. Nevertheless, Olga persisted. She petitioned Constantinople for clerics and advisors, seeking to establish a bishopric in Kiev that would formalize the Christian presence in her capital. This ambition, however, was largely frustrated by local resistance. Without the authority of the prince, her son's such ecclesiastical foundations remained weak. Many of her efforts at religious reform had to remain unofficial, tied to the institutions she herself controlled. Still, she laid important groundwork. Churches were constructed, monasteries endowed, and clerical training quietly began. Some sources suggest that she personally supported the Christian education of young nobles, possibly in anticipation of a future generation that might embrace her vision more fully. One of these children, perhaps, was her grandson Vladimir. Vladimir, born in the early 960s to Sviatoslav and a servant woman named Malusha, was of ambiguous social standing but destined to become the heir through circumstance and brutality. Raised at Olga's court, he'd likely absorbed the competing influences of his grandmother's Christian convictions and his father's militant paganism. Olga, advanced in age, saw in him the potential for continuity, not just of bloodline, but of ideological transformation. This intergenerational dynamic played a critical role in Olga's final years. With Sviatoslav increasingly absent on military campaigns, raiding into the Balkans, fighting the Khazars, and later confronting the Pechenegs, Olga once again found herself responsible for the stability of Kiev. She managed trade routes, maintained court rituals, and received foreign envoys. Her name became associated with peace and order, even among those who distrusted her faith. Ironically, Sviatoslav's obsession with conquest may have reinforced Olga's influence. In his absence, the institutions she had founded, tribute collection centers, religious sites, and bureaucratic offices, kept the realm functioning. The deeper he ventured into external campaigns, the more essential her domestic governance became. But beneath the veneer of stability, deeper fractures lingered. In one obscure episode preserved in ecclesiastical records, a Christian cleric traveling through the Rus's territories was seized by a pagan mob and subjected to a mock execution, hung by his arms from a tree and doused with freezing water, left to shiver in silence. The message was clear. Christian influence was still unwelcome in many quarters. Despite these tensions, Olga remained steadfast. She surrounded herself with Christian advisors and ensured that her household followed Christian rites. She reportedly converted several members of her immediate retinue, creating a miniature court of the faithful within a larger pagan society. These efforts, while limited in scale, were crucial in preserving continuity. They ensured that Christianity would not vanish with her death. Her declining health in the late 960s marked the beginning of the end. By this time, Sviatoslav had returned to Kiev, only briefly setting in motion a campaign to move the capital to Pereyaslavice on the Danube, a strategic but overreaching plan. Olga protested, warning that such a move would leave the heartland vulnerable. he dismissed her confident in his military strength. As her condition worsened, she is said to have requested a Christian burial in the presence of clergy at her deathbed. According to the primary chronicle, she was buried according to Christian rites, a rare and pointed statement in a society where cremation, or burial with grave goods, remained the norm for elites. Sviatoslav honored her request but refused to convert, declaring again that his warriors would mock him for such a choice. Olga died in 969, having ruled for more than 2 decades, either as regent or de facto sovereign. Her funeral, conducted by the priests she had brought from Constantinople, marked a quiet but profound moment in Russia's history, the first formal Christian burial of a ruler in a land still largely governed by pagan custom. It would take nearly 3 more decades for her dream to be fulfilled. Her grandson Vladimir, raised at her court tempered by civil war, and eventually enthroned as Grand Prince, would convert to Christianity in 988 and impose the new faith across the Russes. Churches would rise and stone idols would be cast into rivers, and the Christianization of Kievan Russes would be proclaimed not as a novelty, but as a return to the path laid by Olga. Her legacy, however, remained complex. To the Christian chroniclers who would later canonize her, she was a saint, the first to bring light to a dark land. To the pagans of her time, she was a foreignizing force, suspicious and divisive. To historians, she is both a transitional figure who wielded violence with precision, yet foresaw the need for something more enduring than fear. Her methods, deception, ritualized killing, and psychological warfare were not softened by her faith. If anything, her conversion added a new layer of ideological authority to her rule. But what truly set her apart was her vision. She understood that kingdoms held together by the sword would fracture unless bound by law, faith, and shared identity. In the centuries that followed, Olga's memory was venerated by both church and state. Canonized as equal to the apostles, she stood alongside the great Christianizers of Europe. Her name was invoked not only in prayers, but in court rituals and royal genealogies, a matriarch of fire and baptism. She was not a reformer in the modern sense, nor a monarch of mercy. She was a ruler forged in vengeance, shaped by survival, and animated by an ambition that stretched beyond the tribal logic of her age. Olga of Kiev had buried her enemies in fire, and from the ashes she laid the foundations of a Christian empire. In the years following Queen Olga's death in 969, the Kievan Russes entered a period of heightened military expansion under her son Sviatoslav. The contrast between their 2 modes of rule could not have been sharper. Where Olga had relied on psychological mastery and administrative foresight, Sviatoslav pursued glory through battlefield exploits, leaving little time or patience for long-term governance. Though he respected his mother's authority during her life, he had shown little interest in the spiritual framework she had begun to cultivate. After her funeral, which was conducted according to Christian rites in defiance of prevailing pagan custom, Sviatoslav wasted little time in resuming his military campaigns. He transferred his base of operations to Pereyaslaviets on the Danube, a strategic hub he envisioned as the new capital of the Rus. There, he pushed deeply into Balkan territory, confronting both the First Bulgarian Empire and later the Byzantine military machine itself. His vision was expansive, perhaps even imperial, but it lacked the logistical and administrative infrastructure needed to support such ambitions. This dissonance between conquest and consolidation, between pagan force and Christian institution, would lead to instability. Sviatoslav's decision to leave Kiev under the protection of his generals and his 3 sons while he campaigned abroad introduced succession tensions that would explode into civil war after his death. His brutal killing by the Pechenegs who fashioned his skull into a drinking cup, a haunting echo of the very brutality that had defined his reign, symbolized the unresolved tensions of his era. But Olga's legacy would not end with her son. Her grandson Vladimir, who had been raised in her household, emerged as the eventual victor in the succession struggles that followed Sviatoslav's death. His rule would finally consummate Olga's vision. In 988, Vladimir converted to Christianity and initiated the formal Christianization of the Kievan Russes, ordering the baptism of his subjects and the destruction of pagan idols. Yet Vladimir's actions did not arise in a vacuum. Olga had already paved the path, establishing churches, welcoming foreign priests, and modeling a Christian identity for Kiev's elite. Vladimir simply formalized what she had seeded decades earlier. Without Olga's groundwork, the mass conversion of 988 would likely have failed or taken on a very different form. Over time, Olga's image was transformed and sanctified. She was canonized by the Eastern Orthodox Church, bestowed with the rare title equal to the Apostles, a recognition typically reserved for figures who had initiated the spread of Christianity in new lands. Her feast day, observed on July 11th, became a moment for the faithful to reflect on her unlikely journey from avenger to evangelist. Yet the Church's veneration of Olga often softened the edges of her early reign. Her orchestrated killings, symbolic executions, and ritualized terror campaigns against the Drevlians are sometimes treated as pre-conversion savagery actions, to be forgiven if not forgotten. But such moral partitioning does her a disservice. These were not random acts of violence, but deliberate methodical strategies that allowed her to secure power, enforce loyalty, and build the very foundation upon which later religious reforms would rest. Far from being contradictory, the two phases of her reign destruction and transformation were part of a coherent political arc. Olga understood that peace required strength, and strength required spectacle. She used cultural knowledge, psychological insight, and political timing to enforce her will across disparate regions and hostile populations. Then, once stability was achieved, she turned to diplomacy, institutional reform, and religious patronage to sustain what she had built. Her legacy also complicates the modern understanding of medieval female power. Olga was not a figurehead or an exception. She was a sovereign in her own right. She ruled without a male counterpart for years and did so not through compromise, but through bold, often violent assertion of authority. Her ability to manipulate custom, perform diplomacy, and implement statecraft while navigating a deeply patriarchal society set her apart not only in Eastern Europe, but across the medieval world. There is also a disturbing genius in how she inverted ritual to consolidate power. The live burial of envoys under the guise of hospitality, the immolation of dignitaries in a bathhouse sanctified by custom, the massacre disguised as a funeral feast. Each act shattered the expected patterns of elite interaction and rewrote the rules of engagement. She wielded tradition like a blade, reshaping it to serve her own ends. Perhaps most haunting is how she used fire, not only as a weapon of destruction, but as a metaphor for purification. The burning of Iskarostan with birds transformed into incendiaries was a vivid illustration of total control. It did not merely annihilate the enemy, it sent a message that no sanctuary, no home, no symbol of comfort was safe from her reach. Fire in Olga's hands became both punishment and prophecy. And yet her twilight years suggest a ruler not consumed by violence, but seeking redemption or perhaps longevity. Her embrace of Christianity was not a surrender, but a rebranding one that allowed her to pass power to a new generation while ensuring that her name would not fade with tribal memory. Through the church, she became eternal. In the centuries after her death, Olga's life became legend. She appeared in illuminated manuscripts, church murals, and epic chronicles not merely as the first Christian in Russes, but as its first true strategist. The widow who buried her enemies in fire had become the matriarch of a Christian state. Queen Olga of Kiev occupies a singular place in the historical record, not simply as a woman who ruled in an age of men, but as a sovereign who redefined what rulership meant in the volatile world of 10th century Eastern Europe. Her reign stitched together vengeance and statecraft brutality and belief, legacy, and law. She did not merely respond to crisis. She engineered responses that rewrote the rules of power across a fractured landscape. Her legacy is inseparable from the bloodshed that marked its beginning. The murder of Prince Igor set in motion one of the most systematic campaigns of retribution in medieval history. Yet it was never vengeance for vengeance's sake. Each act served a political function, removing rivals, projecting dominance, transforming fear into governance. Olga's genius lay not in her cruelty, but in her mastery of cause and effect. Her enemies died not in chaotic retaliation, but in orchestrated demonstrations that warned others of the cost of defiance. That same clarity of purpose guided her in peace. Olga's reforms, her establishment of administrative centers, tribute codification, and urban development, were quiet revolutions in a realm long dependent on itinerant power. Her conversion to Christianity, while personal, also served a strategic role aligning the Russes with Byzantium, legitimizing the central court, and offering a framework for future consolidation. But perhaps her most profound legacy lies in her ability to hold contradictions without collapsing under them. She was a Christian who orchestrated massacres, a widow who ruled alone, a regent who became a queen in all but name, a figure feared by her enemies yet later canonized as a saint. In the centuries that followed, Olga became a symbol, a sainted ancestor, a unifying matriarch, a political model invoked by princes and patriarchs alike. Yet behind the icon was a woman who, in an era of brutal uncertainty, crafted a new political order, not from inherited tradition but from personal will and historical clarity. Olga of Kiev was not merely the widow who buried her enemies in fire. She was the architect of a state,